Okay, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much for being here. And I'm very impressed that you arranged a seminar about feminist approach. Now, in Sweden, the topic today is feminist approaches to economic policy. And in Sweden, there are 5 parties out of 8 that call themselves feminist parties. And it's the Center Party, the Liberal Party, the Green Party, the Social Democratic Party, and the Leftist Party. And even today, also the government calls itself a feminist government. And there is also this small party, the Feminist Initiative, which is not represented in the parliament, but in some municipalities, for example, in Stockholm. So this means, of course, that there are many different feminist approaches to economic policy, and that a feminist approach can mean very different things. What should be included in economic policy can also be discussed. Now, for example, we heard about shorter working hours. That is, for example, the topic from the leftist party in Sweden. They think that would further gender equality. While other parties would say, no, we need more hours and more people working. Otherwise, we won't have a sustainable welfare state. And that would be very bad for women and for gender equality. This Swedish feminist government, they have invited people from EU countries to what is called a mutual learning seminar about taxation. And I was asked to write the discussion paper from Sweden about the introduction of individual taxation in Sweden. And I think introducing individual taxation in Sweden or in general is a very good example and a main example of a feminist approach to economic policy. So I want to talk about that to start with, but then I will also take some other examples, and I also will mention some places where I think we need a feminist approach. So anyway, in 1960 in Sweden, the parliament decided, almost everyone voted and said family-based taxation should be maintained. Individual taxation was not a question on the agenda, but a couple of years later, the situation had changed completely. There were strong arguments in favor of individual taxation, and organizations and parties started to reconsider their positions. And in 1971, individual-based taxation was introduced. Now, behind this was the sudden interest in individual taxation was a result of this intense discussion in the 1960s in Sweden about so-called gender roles at that time. And they applied, I would say, a feminist approach to individual taxation. The discussion in Sweden, they was started by individuals. They did not belong to any party or any organization. It was young, well-educated women that started this discussion. But there were also some influential social democratic and liberal women that participated in this discussion. And for example, was Karin Kock. She was a feminist economist, and she was also Sweden's first female member of the cabinet, of the government in the 1940s. She argued that the current tax system is built on ideas from the last century, when the ideal was that a wife only worked for the family, and when one was made to believe that the husband supported his wife. It was made to believe, I think. She was, as I said, a feminist and an economist. So she calculated the GDP, and she included women's unpaid work in Sweden between, I think it was 1860 and 1931 or something. Anyway, the women who advocated individual taxation argued that family-based taxation was unfair to single persons and benefited, as they said, the not fully occupied housewife without children, especially in high-income families. The conservative side of the debate maintained that the tax system should be neutral in relation to married women's employment. Women's right to be supported housewife should not be questioned. The radical side objected that no tax system is neutral. This existing system benefited housewives and was based on an old-fashioned idea that married women should be supported by their husbands. Society had no reason to support this kind of a family, especially not if there were no children there. So women's labor force participation, gender equality, and the dual earner, dual carer family model were put forward as a modern alternative to the old male breadwinner, female housewife family. So, and in this discussion, women's economic independence from men was strongly underlined or seen as a condition for women's emancipation, simply. The problem then, for the Social Democrats who were in power, was to design an individual tax system in a way that it did not foremost benefit high-income families and was unfavorable to low-income, male breadwinner, female housewife families. But when it was shown by these individual women in articles in the press that the deductions that the husband can do for his non-employed wife, and also lower tax for married people than for single persons, was more beneficial for high-income families than for low-income families. Then the Social Democrats could buy this idea about individual taxation. So women's question, which initially was perceived as an upper-class problem, could be reformulated as a working-class disadvantage, and then it could be accepted. So the Prime Minister, Olof Palme, at that time, he said that this change will mainly benefit low-income families, but he also stressed that it was good for women's emancipation and for women's labor force participation. So here, eventually, this meant that the arguments about married women's labor force participation, gender equality, and income distribution all pointed towards an individual income taxation. The opposition came mainly from the conservative political camp, the Conservative Party at that time, the tax lawyers, representatives from the Swedish Confederation of Professional Associations and taxpayers' organizations, but also from trade unions, and from within the Social Democratic Party and the Social Democratic women. And the housewife, they organized a campaign for signing against this introduction of individual taxation. And they collected 60,000 signatures, which was quite a lot at that time. And they demonstrated outside the parliament. I think there was a drawback, though, because the woman who organized this, nobody has said that, but I think it might have been a problem. She was a wife of a professor, and not a working class housewife. So anyway, but influential men in the press, in the political parties, and in the social partners, they took stand for the young, well-educated women who spoke about change and presented a new ideology and a new contract between women and men. Then, in this new individual tax system, which was introduced then in 1971, husband and wife were seen as two separate individual economic subjects, but there was still family-based parts in the tax system. So, for example, individual taxation on business and farm income was still there, and most of what was most important was that unearned income, that is income from property, capital gain, support, and other things were still on their family basis. And this was not taken away until 1988. And there was also a special, which I think maybe was smart, because there was and I think this has been also in other countries, you had a housewife deduction. If your wife did not work, you could make a deduction. And this in Sweden, this was introduced at the same time, so the low-income male breadwinner housewife family should not be too much hurt. But they kept this deduction at a nominal value, so the value of it decreased over time. But it wasn't taken away until 1991. Joint taxation of wealth was enforced until such taxation was eliminated altogether in 2007. So it took 36 years from the start to the end to a fully individual taxations. Now, this also meant that this new taxation system talked about another kind of contract between women and men. So it was not only an economic question, it was also a culture or something question. Women and men were two individual economic subjects. And I think it's also important when you think about this individual taxation that, I mean, we know quite a lot about women's struggle for the right to vote, but we know very little about women's struggle to have the right to pay taxes. There's very little research about this, I think, in the world. I don't know, but I think so. Anyway, today, or most OECD countries have had family-based taxation at the beginning of the 1970s. But today, almost all countries have separate taxation or individual taxation, or you could have an option. So 23 out of 34 OECD countries have individual-based taxation in 2015. 5 have purely family-based tax system. Estonia, France, Luxembourg, Portugal, and Switzerland. And in a number of countries you can choose: Germany, Ireland, Norway, Poland, Spain, and the United States. But even those countries that have individual-based taxation have some elements of family-based, some family-based elements in their taxation system. So, the only 2 countries that have fully individual taxation system is Sweden and Finland, actually. But there is also but, because some other researchers you can classify the countries in different ways, actually. I mean, there can be some differences. Okay, so we think in Sweden that we were first in 1971, but that's not the case. Norway introduced individual taxation as an option in 1959. And Denmark introduced it in 1967, but they still had some family-based elements in there, and they still do, as you can see here, Denmark. And Anita, where are you? Down there. She has told me that in Finland you actually had individual taxations in the 1930s, but it was taken away and it became joint taxation again, and then individual taxation in Finland came 1976. One area where I think we need more feminist approaches or gender perspective is income distribution. The family is still often seen as in spite of the individual taxation, the family is still seen as the basic economic unit. For example, in studies of income distribution. And the point of departure is in general disposable income. The incomes are distributed between the individuals in the household, taking into consideration the number of persons to be supported. And the disposable income, they represent the level of consumption or the economic standard in the household. And the households are then used in these studies, usually both as the unit of income, but also as the unit of analysis. There are other income distribution studies where they use the household as a unit of income, but the individual as a unit of analysis. It's still the point of departure is the economic standard of the individual, and it is decided by the household income, not by the individual income. So in a household with two adults, wife and husband are allocated equally big incomes, since the total income is distributed evenly, even though one person, usually the husband, makes more money than the other, usually the woman. So irrespective of which of these methods you use, it is the household that makes what the individual have, what kind of economic standard the individual have. And who is making the money, or who is making more money than the other, it doesn't matter. It is of no interest. And I mean, this has to do, I think, with economic theory, and Gary Becker sees the family as a unit, and work is divided between husband and wife as a rational choice for the family. So that there's no need for any discussion. But this perspective on the family as a unit free of conflicts and fair distribution of economic standard is in sharp contrast to the feminist perspective, which maintain that the gender division of labor in the family, the male breadwinner model, and women's dependence on men are central mechanisms through which women's subordinate position in the family and in society at large is upheld. That is the basic thing. So according to feminist theory, the key to women's emancipation and economic independence is employment for her, and wage work for her, and income of her own. A woman's income gives her a voice, a possibility to influence the decisions in the family, and she has the possibility to leave the relationship if it's not satisfactory. So individual income is very important, and not only the family income. And I think we should try to do more when it comes to doing income distribution studies on an individual basis. Now, in Sweden, we have done investigations about economic gender equality 3 times. One time in 1997, one in 2005, and one in 2015. In the two first investigations, the goal of gender equality policy was that women and men should have the same possibilities, rights, and duties. And women and men should have the same possibilities to economic independence. Now, I was involved in this, and I was thinking, what is economic independence? I mean, you have to know that to be able to investigate if we have come closer or not. So I pestered my colleagues about this. What do you mean by economic independence? And the interesting thing was that when I asked the women, they said it is to have a job of your own, a wage, so you can support yourself. But when I asked the men what economic independence was, they said it is to have so much own means that I don't have to wage work. So economic independence, I think, have very different meanings when it comes to women and men. But we very seldom speak about men as economically independent or dependent. Anyway, they are not dependent on women, but women who are economically dependent are on men. So I think the concept economic independence has, when it comes concerning women, a gender perspective. When it is for men, it has a class perspective. So it has different meanings. So in the new gender equality goals in Sweden, which were accepted in 2006, the concept economic self-sufficiency, självständighet, was used instead of economic independence. And they say that the motive for this change was that the concept economic independence has been used in order for women to be able to support themselves and children, if any, and not being dependent on a man. Since most women and men are dependent on wages and transfer for their support, the concept economic independence is partly misleading. Very few are independent in the meaning that they have private means big enough so that they do not need to work for their support. But to be dependent on work income is not lack of independence. The government therefore proposes that the concept economic self-sufficiency is used in order to mark that women and men should have the same right and possibility to support themselves and their children. But the problem, I was involved in the next one also, investigation, and I have problems again with this the definition of gender equality, economic gender equality. It says that the goal for economic gender equality today is women and men must have the same opportunities and conditions as regards paid work, which give economic self-sufficiency throughout life. Now, I don't think economic self-sufficiency and economic gender equality is the same thing. Economic self-sufficiency is about reaching a certain level of income so you can support yourself and children if you have any. But gender equality is that women and men have about the same income, the same level of incomes. So women and men can be economically gender equal without being economically self-sufficient. Economic gender equality is, for example, common among young people. They have often, the difference in income is not so big among young people, but they can't support themselves. While older people, middle-aged people, the income differences are often much bigger between women and men, but they can both support themselves. So it's not the same thing, I think. Anyway, the Swedish government has made an annex to the budget every year since 2002, and it's about economic gender equality between women and men. And there they describe the incomes of women and men. And this is then from work income, and then you apply income of capital and transfers and all this. And you can see that the women's work income as a percentage of men's is 74%. But then if you look at individual disposable income, and this is individual, I mean, it's the money that women and men individually have earned or received as transfer. It has nothing to do with the family or anything. It's not involved. It's 80%. And so the work income is 74%, but individual disposable income is 80%. So transfer and taxes even out the gender differences in income. It helps for women. But also when you look at income of capital, for example, women have much less income of capital. So one way of, if that would be the only goal, gender equality, then you should tax capital more than labor. Yeah. Well, anyway, this gives an idea what you could do to change the economic gender equality. This one. Anyway, women's economic self-sufficiency, then being able to support themselves, has increased since the 1970s. Cohabiting married women's share of household has increased from 31% in 1975 to 43% in 2014. And this can mostly be explained by women's longer working hours and higher employment rate. But on the other hand, nothing much has changed since middle of 1990s. The share of cohabiting married households where the woman has a higher income than her husband has increased also, since the middle of the 1990s. In 1995, 21% of the women had a higher disposable income than her husband, and this share increased to around 28% in 2014. In this annex, it's also discussed how the different policy proposals will influence gender equality and women and men and their incomes. The same problem as with income distribution studies is in poverty studies. Again, a household is defined as being poor if its average level of resources falls below the poverty level. So this means if you live in a household which is poor, then you as an individual is also poor. And this is a problem because the household is a unit of analysis. And then it might be hard to judge what to do about income poverty. And today, when we want to say something about women's and men's individual poverty, then you only can use, or not only, but it is used data comparing single women and men, which is, I mean, it's a minority, and it's also special groups. So, so poverty measures today, they overestimate men's individual poverty and underestimate women's poverty. Then there are also some research, which I think is very important, that we should, or maybe we need both, or a shift in focus for the risk of poverty to a risk of dependency. And this would be very much in line with the Swedish economic gender equality policy. Now, I say something about the labor market because that's where it's the basis, of the differences in income between women and men is the labor market, and and also at home, it goes together. It's the gender division of labor, simply. Men doing more paid work and women less paid work. And this has to be changed, of course. This shows the employment rate for fathers and mothers with children 0 to 6 years old in Sweden, and men and women 16 to 64 years. And you can see that up until 1990, the development was very different for women and men. For women, it was going up, and for men, it was going down slowly, but very little. But then from 1990, there was this economic crisis in Sweden, and since then, women's and men's employment rate, they follow each other. And they follow the economic cycles, simply. When it comes to economic recession, then, there is one theory that at the onset of, in the start of an economic recession, men tend to lose more than women. And the reason for this is the gender-segregated labor market, where men work in construction and industries, and many women work in the public sector. And the sectors where men work, they are much more influenced by the economic cycles than the public sector, or has been anyway. So if employment in the public sector shelters women in a recession, then women's employment in Sweden and in the Nordic countries could be expected to be relatively secure, since the Nordic countries has the highest share of employees in the public sector of all the OECD countries. And a very big majority of those who work in the public sector are women. And when we looked a bit at this in different EU countries, you can see that the downfall for men comes first, and then women comes afterwards. But then if there is, when it goes up again, then women women might be protected in a recession, but they may be in a disadvantage when it goes up again. And that you can see a bit. And especially then if there is cuts in the public sector, and there is stores in public employment. So a highly segregated labor market, a big public sector, and women's overrepresented in this sector may then turn into a disadvantage. And then I thought maybe we could look a bit at the different Nordic countries, and I compare 2006 and 2016. Denmark was the country that was, if you compare these, I mean, it's difficult to know which years you should use, but if we accept that I compared 2006 and 2016, then Denmark, the employment fell most in Denmark, actually, and more for men than for women, with 3.7 percentage points for men, and for women with 3.5 percentage points. The next one, surprisingly, at least for me, was Norway. And there the employment rate for men decreased with 3.3 percentage points, while for women it was the same. In Finland, the men's employment rate decreased with 2.2 percentage point, and here more for women actually, with 2.9 percentage points. And then Iceland, which also I was kind of surprised, because I mean they had a very bad economic crisis in Iceland, but they going back fast. For men, it's more or less the same, the employment rate in 2006 and 2016. For women, it has gone up with 3.3 percentage points. So Iceland is doing...
That is Sweden.
Oh, too bad. Sweden is doing not too bad either. For men, it's about the same. And for women, it has gone up with 2.2 percentage point. No, then Iceland. I don't know. Iceland is recovering, I guess. And especially for women there. For men it's about the same, but for women it's 3.3 percentage points going up. So actually, men in all Nordic countries, now if you compare 2006 and 2016, have lost employment, except in Sweden, where it's more or less the same. Women's employment has decreased in Denmark and Finland, it's about the same in Norway, and increased in Sweden and Iceland. So on the whole then, in the Nordic countries, women's employment has fared better than men's, if we compare these 2 years. The public sector might have something to do with this, the big public sector in the Nordic countries, but according to some investigation, it also has something to do with the shift to services where women work very much in services, but also that the educational level of women is higher in all Nordic countries than men's. So women is doing quite well, not quite well, but they are doing better than men. Now, that does not mean, of course, that women's employment rate is higher than men's. If we look at this, but this is also, it's a very big difference in the employment rate between the Nordic countries, where they are lowest in Finland, 83% for men, and in Iceland, it's 93%. It's 10 percentage points higher in Iceland. And also for women in Finland and Iceland, there is a big difference. Now, one thing is, though, which we might know, that part-time employment is not very common in Finland, but in the other Nordic countries among women, where about a third or something work part-time. Now, part-time, when we measure gender equality, we often use the employment rate. But this is, in Sweden at least, and I think maybe not in the Nordic countries in general, it's not so important anymore. It's the working hours in Sweden that's important. Swedish-born women's employment rate is higher than foreign-born men's in Sweden. But the working hours among foreign-born men is higher than Swedish-born women. So it's the hours are very important, not the employment rate in Sweden so much anymore. Now, when it comes to part-time unemployment, I think this also has to do with how you define things. When we talk about unemployment, we usually talk about full-time unemployment. But in Sweden, then, there were and we think that women work part-time because they are going to take care of children. And many do. But it's more common that women in Sweden and men work part-time because they can't find more hours. So underemployment or part-time employment is a very, I think, important feminist issue. Because so many more women want to work more hours, and this, of course, influences their incomes. And this shows how the underemployment has developed. And in the crisis in the beginning of the 1990s, we talked about the unemployment, but that was full-time unemployment. If a person is underemployed, a person is counted as employed if that person works 1 hour. If that same person is unemployed 39 hours, it's not counted. So we have a very, not a very good picture of women's underemployment and unemployment. So this is also in Sweden now. There are many projects about this about the right to full-time employment. So, how many? One or two. Okay, then I skip to the next one. Because this is also, I think, interesting. And this is also, I mean, we talked about, at least in Sweden, we have to work more hours, we have to work later up in life. And the big difference between the Nordic countries in how big a proportion of the people between 55 and 64 are employed. And again, and this is interesting because it's actually lower for men in Finland than for women. But in the other countries, it's the women. And this is, again, it has to do with pensions, which is also a very big feminist issue in Sweden and also in other countries. And I think we have to do something about that. I have one more picture. This is about unemployment for people between 25 and 64 years old. And Iceland is hardly any unemployment at all. Finland is quite high. And in Iceland and in Denmark, the unemployment rate is higher for women than for men. But in other countries, it's higher for men than for women. But what I wanted to show also is that I think a feminist approach or a gender perspective on economic policy is very important. But it's far from enough. I mean, women and men are two categories, but within this category, you have big, big differences. And I want to show this one. This is the unemployment rate between native-born and foreign-born men and women in Sweden today. And as you can see, and also age. And you can see if you're young, if you're between 15 and 24, then the unemployment rate is high. But most of these people they are in education of some kind. But if you look at women native born between 25 and 54 in Sweden, it's 2.6. That's also very low employment rate. But if you look at the foreign born in Sweden in the same age group, then the unemployment rate is 14%. So I mean, being foreign-born is much worse than being a woman, if you're unemployed. And the same for men, of course. And in all cases, women's unemployment rate is lower than men's. So gender perspective is good, but other things need to be taken care of also. Okay?
Yeah.